Okay, ICS3U, here are the 3 types of variables that you should know. Strings. So strings are any sequence of characters that you can think of. These include passwords that you could type in if you're signing up for an app or a web service. Anything you can type on the keyboard, including some characters that are difficult to type on a keyboard. Anything you can press shift and get. It includes spaces. It even includes things like the return key and the space bar. All those things are considered parts of strings. All right. And there's some examples of strings down here. ABC, noter, space, dame with capital letters. There's a password with a $sign in it. Any of those characters that you can type by pressing shift. There are some characters that you can't type from a keyboard, but you can copy and paste. Those are also considered parts of strings, and we'll talk about those more later. Now you'll notice that I have the number 47 here as an example of a string. Now if you tried to do addition on that number, Python would give you an error. So you can store 47 in a string type variable, but if it's a string type variable, you won't be able to easily do addition, subtraction, or any kind of arithmetic on it. The other 2 types are number types. There's integers and floats. Integers, everyone's heard about integers before. Those are whole numbers, including 0. So any negative number, 0, or positive number that are whole with no decimal places. Those are integers. There's some examples of them. And then floats. Floats include any number at all. Now, you will get an error if you try to type in a character like the letter A and store it in an integer or a float. But getting back to floats, floats include any decimal number you can think of. Repeating decimals like 3.3 with a bar across, like you've seen in math, those cannot be easily represented in a computer. They can be approximated, but the way that we store decimal numbers, it only stores a discrete or a certain amount of decimals in there. Now let's look at the next section of this document. Pause it if you need to digest some of that. But casting. So casting is a way that we can convert from one type to another. So if you have 47, you store it in X. 47, without any quotes, if you do X equals 47 in Python, that will be stored as an integer. However, you can use this str with a bracket. And if you use str with a bracket, I'm just going to try to highlight this to make it easier to see. Str with a bracket and then the end bracket. That will allow you to convert 47 to a string. So str is a special function that allows us to convert a number into a string. And as you can see, we're storing it in strx. I want you to just to recall, whenever you're using a single equal sign in a programming language, in most of them, think of it as a set equals. Okay, so this first line we said set x equal to 47. It's kind of like let x represent. The next line, strx, set it equal to the string representation of 47. Once we do that, strx cannot be used to perform any arithmetic. Going to the next column here, this is an example where we have a string and we're converting it into an integer. So here's the integer casting. It's the word int. Casting means we're just converting it from one type to another. So there we go. So if we have strx is set to 12, for example, with quotes around it, that's a string, kind of like a password or a name. But if we want to be able to perform any arithmetic on it, we can use this int function around it that I've highlighted and then store it in another variable. I just happen to call this variable int x. I could have called it anything I wanted. You could call this whatever. You could call it g, for example, and then it would be stored in a variable called g. But int x, I think, is more descriptive. I'm going to try to get you to get into the habit of using variable names that describe the kind of content that is in there. So int x is a good name because it's saying, you look at that, okay, it's an integer, and it's the integer representation of whatever x is. X, by the way, is a terrible variable name because it could mean anything at all. Instead of x, I'd rather, let's say that you're writing a program where you're keeping track of the cost of an item. It would be a lot better to have a variable called cost instead of x because it's descriptive. So when you go back to that program a few days or a few weeks or months later, you see that variable cost and you have a pretty good idea of what you're trying to store in that, as opposed to x, which could mean anything. Okay, let's look at the last one here, floats. Let's look at casting with floats. So in this program, int x is set to 99. Des(x) is a new variable, and we're setting it equal to the float representation. So I'm highlighting this again. Here's how we cast using a float. And I'm not very good with my mouse here. So we're going to say float int x. So that allows us to get decimal number. Remember, floats are decimal numbers that we just saw that up above. So that allows us to get the decimal representation of the integer and store it in a variable called des(x). So now if we wanted to add maybe $32.50 with des(x) 99, we would come up with a value total x that is a decimal representation. So just be aware, in Python, it handles different variable types in this particular way. And I want you to notice that we can create a variable without really telling Python. In other programming languages, you have to actually say, okay, I want to make a variable that's going to be an integer. But in Python, you just create the variable and give it a value. In Python, it figures it out what kind of a variable you want to use based on the content, which has its pros and cons. This is probably my least favorite part about Python, and will be for this semester, but it's an excellent language for learning how to program. This little bit can be a little bit tricky, so just if you're a little bit confused, that's okay. Go over this lesson again, and I'll be talking about it in class as well. So I put a note here, and I'll just read it out. Use integer and string, so int and string, to change back and forth between integers and strings. We'll mostly be using integers and strings. We won't be using floats as often. So let's see, we are at 7 minutes now. What else do we have on this document? Unintentional types. Oh, wait a minute. So we have note, casting a float into an int will truncate it or cut off the number, not round it. Okay, so let's say that you had, let's take a look at this. So what it's saying here, I'm just going to do something here. So let's say that we had a value. So we had cost equals $3.99. And then we're going to say int cost equals int bracket cost. Well, the value of cost is not going to be $4. It doesn't round it. Because in math class, ever since you were learning how to round numbers, you saw that a number like 3.99 would get rounded to 4. That makes sense, if to the nearest integer. But with casting, with integer, it just cuts this part off. So if you do this program, and I'm going to say, if you're a little bit confused or you're not sure, go to the computer, go into Replit, or if you're in VS Code, go ahead and do that. I'm just going to make this look a bit nicer. And try it out to see what kind of a value is getting printed on the screen here. All right? So as I was saying, try this out. I'll tell you right now, it's going to print out the value 3 because the int casting a float into an integer will truncate it. I'll leave that there. There's another program here that I'd like you to try typing out and trying it. It's called Unintentional Types.py. So let's see if I can get this. So what I would like you to do, and this document is going to be shared with you, type out, and guys, I'm going to recommend try to not copy and paste. Try to actually type it out. It's just like copying out a note. It's going to go in to your brain more ways than one. If you're actually typing it out, you're going to be noticing more about the actual code that you may not notice if you're just copying and pasting. And it's almost like using, half of your brain versus your whole brain. So I'm going to recommend take a few minutes, pause the video, type this out into either Replit or Visual Studio Code, and then come back. Okay, so you're back now, and this is called Unintentional Types. Maybe you got a chance to try it. If you haven't, go ahead and try it, and I'll try to explain what this program does. All right, so we have an integer that's set to 12. It's called int(x), and we have a string called strx. These are two separate variables. strx contains the same information to your eye as int(x), but it's completely different information to the computer. Whereas int(x) is an integer that you can add and subtract to, strx is not. strx is, you can't add or subtract to it. So I know you've had a chance to copy this out by now. Go ahead and try doing this. Try doing, wait a minute, can you see my screen? Yes, you can, good. Try doing this, and you should get an error on line 3, because you can't add 1 to an str, or if you do, it's going to look very strange. There you go, type error. It says, can only concatenate. Concatenate is just a fancy word for put together. So with a string, it's trying to take strx, which is a string, something you can't add to, and just jam the number 1 on the end of it, because it doesn't know how to add a string and an integer. In order to add those two things, they both have to be the same type. They both have to be numbers at least. Okay, so int strx, that fixes it. That's what we originally had. The next two lines, let's take a look. The next two lines, we're taking we're making a new variable called desx. It's going to look to your eyes the same information as, it's going to say, it's going to have 12 in there. However, it's taking int(x), it's converting it into a float, which is a decimal number, and setting desx equal to that. Then it's printing desx divided by 5. Now what happens if we try to divide int(x) by 5? I'm going to do this. I'm going to actually do print int(x) divided by 5. So I just added a 7th line there. You can see that. Print int(x) divided by 5. And when we run it, even though desx and int(x), okay, what just happened here? Python is choosing to do decimal division for both of them, even though int(x) is an integer. All right, all you need to know, use the correct type. So in this case, if we are dividing it by 5, even though int(x) would work, please try to use desx, which is a float. For those of you that might be curious as to the next step, the backslash is integer division. This isn't really part of the lesson, but I just want to show you guys what would happen if we did that. We get a syntax error, and it's not quite working because it's not integer division. Just forget what I said. Use desx instead, because that's how we are able to divide by 5. If we're getting a decimal number, then we want to use floats. All right, so that's good for this lesson. We're about 13 minutes in, and I believe that that's all of our document. There is an issue if you try to cast it as an integer later on. So I'm just going to go quickly to Replit, and if you try to do this, int bracket desx divided by 5, and you run it, it'll just show you, hold on. I was forgetting a bracket at the end, so there's just an extra bracket at the end. By the way, that's a really common mistake that I think that it's good for you to see that, because I can't count the number of times where a student said, well, my code doesn't work. And then I go in, it's just a little bracket that's missing. It's so common. We all make those mistakes. We're all human. And that's going to happen a lot. And it's going to be a little frustrating. But as you can see, when we cast it as an integer, we only get 2. And that's because it truncates it again. Okay, that's the end of this lesson. See you next time.